So anyway, yes, I mean, like everyone, I've had I want to, just extend my thanks. I've had a kind of something of an indoor or an insider seat to just how much work it takes to put this conference on. So really, like, thank you to Daniel and Gloria and Phoebe and Shelvin and everyone who kind of brought this into being. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here. So just a couple words about where this project, or where this paper, where this kind of discussion sits within my broader work, or the project I'm working on right now. And I'm working on a new project on kind of what is a history of the country, or a kind of a history of land from the perspective of the non-plantation. And kind of to consider the country or the countryside, and I'll kind of talk a little bit, in a second about Raymond Williams, as a colonial project. And I've written a lot, for those of who don't know me, written 2 monographs on the tea plantations of particularly the eastern Himalaya, and thinking about the kind of the plantation landscape and life and labor in the plantation as a particular kind of environmental and socio-environmental form. And this project is purposely different, right? To kind of think from the perspective of the plantation's outsides. And that's kind of where I'm coming from here. And so the material that I'll talk about is one of a story of homestays, right? And this is maybe something familiar to you, both within South Asia and beyond. And it comes at the end of the book that I'm working on right now. So it's kind of like where this historical narrative is ending up. And I really kind of want to think about it, what I'm going to talk about is of a piece, or with trends globally. And trends within kind of a turn to the service industry, or just a service economy in the context of climate change. That is a South Asian story, and it is a story that's much broader than that. That really kind of hinges, or kind of turns on, the selling of experiences of the things that perhaps might disappear. And then the great irony of, right, that kind of disappearance is the act of traveling to those sites is exacerbating that disappearance. So kind of how do we kind of think about the service economy, the collapse of production, and the turn to reproduction, the turn to service, especially in the context of climate change. And so this is in dialogue, obviously, certainly with Kadri's paper that we just heard, but also Mabel, Emily's, and Nanaka's paper as well. And this narrative, right, that I want to share with you, this story, is also to kind of really draw some critical attention to stories, to axioms, like axiomatic phrases that I hear a lot, right, in kind of bourgeois kind of coffee shops, say in Calcutta, where, I also like to go. But, that isn't it, like in the kind of a well-trodden statements of, isn't it nice that, quote unquote, and I use this term deliberately, hill people get to make a little bit of money off of these homestays? Isn't it nice? And, it depends on what your definition of nice is. That's kind of what I want, that's kind of where I'm going here. Right, so with that, you can kind of think about niceness. Right, and so the title here, right, this is the kind of title, the working title of the book, and it's a kind of double entendre, right, after the country, the kind of search of retreat in the country, but then also the kind of question of what comes after the country, after it perhaps disappears. Okay, so farming isn't what it used to be. That's what people across Kalimpong told me in the summer of 2022 after a COVID-induced fieldwork hiatus. Something had shifted. In the before times, people were quick to valorize farming as the thing that distinguished Kalimpong, a district of West Bengal in the eastern Himalayan foothills, right? And I don't have it marked out on this map, I realize that I sent, but if you can kind of, Kalimpong town is kind of halfway between the Bhutan border and Darjeeling, and the kind of, right, we're kind of looking at kind of essentially everything almost east, or, just east of Darjeeling, and between east of Darjeeling and west of that Bhutan border. We're talking about Kalimpong. And it's, again, a district within the state of Bengal, West Bengal. So here, farming and tenurial rights to land gave Nepalis and Lepchas and Bhutias, who call Kalimpong home, a different political consciousness, right, people told me. They also told me that Kalimpong had a higher literacy rates, and that people were healthier here than in Darjeeling, right? This is kind of like these well-trodden narratives of folks living in Kalimpong. because they stressed that the tea plantation district of Kalimpong, right, on the other side of the Tista was fundamentally different than this agrarian space, right, this place where people had tenurial rights to land and where they produced not tea, but something you could eat. They produced food, namely rice and makai, or various kind of food grains and vegetables. Okay. That is not to say that farming and really belonging more generally have not always been tenuous here in Kalimpong. But something really seemed different and does seem different in the last couple years. Over the short span of years, right, the livability of this region, and this is again perhaps a broader story that we've heard across many of these papers, particularly in Kalimpong's rural villages, has started to become doubtful. Right, so real peacocks as opposed to statues of peacocks. Peacocks decimating barren fields, right? The number of amazing stories I hear about peacocks, like they'll eat anything. They'll even eat like dale corsanis. They'll even eat like these peppers that are hot, like so hot. Like those, like, eat them right. Like they'll eat them right off of the plants, right? Like peacocks are these. Right, these gnarly animals, right, that you can't throw rocks at, you can't even chase them, people say, lest, right, karmic retribution may befall you. Right, but yet this is now a familiar scene in agrarian spaces in Kalimpong, right? Once productive paddy is now overgrown, it is now barren, it is now overrun with peacocks. Right, because many farmers here in Kalimpong really have stopped farming their land. The cost of production, particularly for rice, has risen above market value. They explain that not only was there no market, but there was no water for agriculture. More and more villagers, especially the youth, were migrating to India's cities or abroad in search of work in the service industry. Right, so the cities, right, Delhi primarily, but also kind of abroad in service sector. Has something changed during the pandemic? I kind of, asked myself when I arrived in 2022, and right, I want to kind of resist a kind of linear narrative like that, because not necessarily, didn't necessarily like all of a sudden abruptly change. Right, I want to kind of think about is what thinking about kind of environmental crisis here in the hills as a crisis that was a long time coming, that was built on a particular scaffolding. Right, plantations, right, as you may know, right, blanket the neighboring areas or the regions of Darjeeling and the Doors. But colonial authorities did not, and actively did not, by design, did not develop Kalimpong for plantations, particularly for tea plantations, but also cinchona, right? Scrape the bark and you get malaria medication. This did not mean, however, that Kalimpong was outside colonial or capitalist control. Just the opposite. Kalimpong was instead settled by British colonial administrators as what was called a government estate. Government estates in colonial Bengal, right, they're across the Sundarbans, like we heard in the first paper. They're across all of rural Bengal, like hundreds and hundreds of them in colonial Bengal. Right, these government estates in colonial Bengal would not exist, however, right, perhaps of course, if not for the prior existence of landed estates in Britain, right? So landed estates, right, Downton Abbey, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen, those landed estates, right, were actively translated to as a form of direct rule in places in Bengal, particularly, as a mode of tenant farming. Right, the landed estate was where techniques of enclosure, land revenue extraction, and social stratification were honed. These techniques were then applied in colonial India in a wide swath, of colonial occupations, right, rural and deltaic, et cetera, but also here in the hills in Kalimpong. Right, and I'm just kind of putting this up, right, to kind of show you, right, the government estate is this kind of, right, term of art, and, right, there's many, many reports like this of the survey and settlement of fill-in-the-blank government estate. Right, the expansion of government estates was inflected importantly by the famines that swept across India, right, particularly Bengal and Bihar in the 1870s as well as the 1880s. In response, the colonial government set up the first of multiple famine commissions. The commissions called for many things, right, including the establishment of a new Bengal agricultural department in 1886. That year, the newly appointed director explained that there was a technocratic solution to famine. This department, his new department, would focus on better methods for cultivation, the diffusion of those methods directly and of implements associated with those methods to farmers in government estates. and as well as then a collection of agricultural statistics on how useful and wonderful and great those methods are and those implements are in upping production and therefore upping land revenue. Right, what was glossed in these colonial reports as the collection of economic facts. Whoops, nope, not yet. So the government estates like Kalimpong, right, on these estates, this post-famine bureaucratic project of keeping people alive, right, keeping them marginally and healthy enough to continue to produce and to continue to produce rent, was linked to a colonial project of ensuring that they worked, right, to do so, right, this kind of cycle. Kalimpong was designed to be a food producer, not just for themselves, right, to kind of, as subsistence agriculture, but to be a food producer for the region, right, including the growing hill station in Darjeeling, right, was, as you know, right, multiple months out of the year during the monsoon, right, the colonial administrative class would ascend to Kalimpong, to Darjeeling, where they needed to be fed, right, feeding them was a big problem. And beginning in the 1880s then, Nepalis, Lepchas, and Bhutias were individually settled, resettled, right, importantly, in individual plots on the government estate and enrolled as tenants and rent-paying farmers. The purpose of this kind of settlement project was ostensibly or directly to prevent famine. But it was also more explicitly aimed at making non-plantation land profitable through revenue extraction. Right, because plantations are kind of blanketing this area, right, and that's kind of a really an economic project that you may all know about, but right, kind of like ensuring that these food-producing enclaves are also viable economic spaces was a colonial problem. So the close measurement of the food supply intertwined with an active investment in farmer productivity. And this reflects a kind of broader biopolitical logic emergent across the British Empire, right? So it brings Kalimpong into kind of dialogue with these other agricultural spaces. So then flash forward to the present. Making a living on one of these small farms, these small plots, individual family plots of land, this is not collective land, these are individual plots, is no longer viable. People are leaving the land, right? They're leaving their farms barren. Why? The reasons I want to kind of stress are multiple and compounding, right? I don't want to kind of get into an X causes Y kind of proposition. Himalayan slopes, right, are not easy to farm. Mechanical methods are costly and ill-suited to the terrain. The other considerations include Kalimpong's hillsides being prone to landslides, right? Food is increasingly shipped up from the plains to the hills on roads. And there are kind of these uncertainties caused by the hydropower installations on the Teesta River, right, that Mabel described on Friday, or yes, right, anyway, many panels ago. But I mean, and like then October 4th, right, as Mabel points out in her paper, kind of is this kind of, like brings attention to the precarity caused by these hydropower installations, but also the kind of connectivity, of these roads linking the plains to the hills. Farmers in Kalimpong are insistent that those dams, right, the dams down the Teesta, were implicated in the growing lack of water, why there was no water for farming, but also for the unpredictability, the growing unpredictability of even just knowing when the seasons would change. So there's those kind of considerations, but then also consider the histories of marginalization, racialization, and labor. In a colonial British taxonomy of labor, Nepalis in particular are framed as a martial race, which made them well-suited for military service. But also, these ascribed racialized qualities and characteristics of loyalty and bravery translated into a penchant for service more broadly. Even today, racialized and gendered narratives circulating in India's urban centers cast people who hail from the hills as being naturally disposed, naturally good at being servants, right? But soldiers, but also nannies, housemaids, and cooks, and other kind of, work within the service sector, right? As like folks like Dolly Kikon and others, and Mabel and Sarah Smith have written about. All right, when I talk to Kalimpong residents about what it means to try to make their homes in the hills amidst this environmental degradation, they bring all of these factors into the frame at the same time. Their confluence, however, is perhaps most evident in the revival of one of the oldest industries in the hills, and that is tourism. So for British and Indian elites, right, this is a kind of, it's a broader, elite project, right? So, I think, Lalita, you brought up the Kanchenjunga, like, Satyajit Ray's kind of, right, imaginary of Kanchenjunga as a particularly kind of Bengali elite project in the 1950s, right? I'll come back to that, but like, it's both and. It's for both colonial elites and kind of elites from Calcutta. Right, this space, right, Darjeeling in particular, but across the West Bengal's Himalayan foothills, have long served as a refuge, as a kind of cool complement, a cool mountainous complement to the hot, disease-ridden even plains. Hill stations like Darjeeling were sanitaria. They were spaces of recuperation, of the social reproduction of Europeans and elite Indians. So the role of these hills as a kind of retreat is now even more kind of pertinent, even more kind of salient, perhaps, as temperatures climb in India's cities. Right, and for those of you who might have been in Kolkata or in the hills in the Eastern Himalayas this past summer, it was really hot. Like this was a huge part of discussion, to the point where like tourists were asking for their money back in the hills because it was so hot. So like the temperatures are rising, this is real. And it's kind of creating this kind of crisis for capital. But anyway, I'll get to that. So access to the hills as retreat has expanded in step with the growth of a kind of urban middle class, right? So this Kanchenjunga imaginary that Satyajit Ray, puts forward is being actively democratized. And it's being actively democratized to kind of all of these different classes of tourism, right? So there's these kind of packages that are being rolled out at any budget, right? And that's kind of key to kind of thinking about tourism today in the hills. It is not just an elite project anymore. So in fact, right, West Bengal's chief minister, Mamata Banerjee, often likens the hills to Switzerland and Kolkata to London, repurposing colonial ways of seeing the hills and naturalizing these images for this growing, this perhaps democratizing consumer base in the state. So the dyad of the country and the city, which Raymond Williams has analyzed in part by reading the idols and accounts of British landed estates, is apt for understanding the hills of Bengal from its urban center. As Williams showed, views of the countryside as bucolic, as stable, as a kind of archive of moral order, right, as a place that is unchanging, obscure the violence of extraction and accumulation. So while farms on the former Kalimpong government estate continue to fail, capital has not given up. Instead, accumulation has shifted to even more intimate spaces, specifically those of social reproduction, right? The house, the home. The government of West Bengal, the state government, is now aggressively promoting homestay tourism as a way of stemming out migration for those small farmers in the hills, and arguably more, a more kind of politically, salient kind of reason why they're doing this is to kind of quash subnational demands in the region, right? So for those of you, familiar with the region, that's the Gorkhaland agitation, right? So as a reason, perhaps a way of kind of quelling any subnational Gorkhaland demands that might emerge in the region. So the countryside, it seems, no longer requires a functioning agricultural economy. Farming families, with help from state development authorities and real estate speculators, again, mostly from Kolkata, are learning to package the government estate, to package the countryside for a mobile and increasingly climate-anxious Indian middle class. Right, and again, there's a class, a stratum to this, right? All of, these are kind of packages that are packaged at every budget. Nope, sorry, I don't want to go there yet. So while tea plantations are also certainly getting in on this game, on this homestay emerging market, it's important to note, and again, that Kalimpong has the most homestays in the state of West Bengal by kind of an order of magnitude, right? Second only to the Sundarbans, and that number is only the registered ones. And this is again, just a metastasizing number of homestays, and the government is actively supporting them. And many of them, right, are opened up and connected with these tourism syndicates, and the kind of an inevitable goal is, of course, to get to Sikkim, right? So they're stopping on their way up in Kalimpong on the way up to to Natula and kind of these other sites in Sikkim. So as farming collapses, it seems easier and certainly more lucrative to sell local and traditional experiences of the hills to middle-class Indian urbanites than to implement land reforms aimed at empowering hill communities. Trickle-down development of course, is not new here. It's a logic of the resource frontier, it's a logic of colonialism, it's a logic of the plantation, and it is a source of ruination. So the cool air and mountain landscape, again, have long drawn people to the region. This is not new, but it is again about kind of intensity and its effects. By 2023, right, this past summer, cars routinely jam on mountain roads, right? Again, eroding, landsliding mountain roads, turning 10-minute drives, even like 5-minute drives, into these hour-long crawls up the mountain, right? As these kind of tourists ply up the mountains to try to escape those, rising temperatures. With each monsoon, these roads are, again, more and more frequently becoming sites of landslides. They're literally giving way. Indian tourists, it seems, in the context of this, are flooding up to the hills while people from Kalimpong are fleeing them. And at the same time, right, and it's important, I just want to kind of make an aside, because I don't talk about it elsewhere in this paper, that many of these kind of homestays are not, they're owned and run by Nepalis and Lepchas, but they're also kind of more and more being leased out by again, mostly Bengali men in Kolkata, and leased out or fully bought, if possible, if it's not tribal land, and being operated as homestays on that, right? So there's the kind of land ownership and land sovereignty kind of issues that are also going on alongside of this as well. But the collapse of farming, all right, here's this causality thing that I want to kind of underscore. The collapse of farming did not cause the rise of homestays, nor did homestays cause the collapse of farming, right? I don't want to kind of like think in this kind of these causal terms, right? And again, Nanaka brings up Amitabh Ghosh, and he has this kind of interesting kind of provocation that I don't think he's ever published, but I heard him kind of speak, he kind of thinks about like, so migration is climate change, or the kind of, right, right, I suppose like migration is caused by climate change, or perhaps, right, in a kind of another Himalayan kind of example, or is like the failing kidneys of Nepali men who went to Qatar to build the World Cup, right? Those kidneys are climate change, right? As opposed to kind of thinking about causality. So there's something kind of evocative that I think about kind of when we're thinking about what is climate change, when we talk about it, what gets to be in that category versus what is, like causality versus beingness. But anyway, when people in Kalimpong talk about these shifts, they talk about, right, these kind of, mega environmental, social, political, economic shifts. They talk about the cars. They talk about the roads that used to be there that are crumbling. And they talk about the landslides that have already happened and those that are yet to come. More water shortages, more dependence on urban traders for basic supplies, and of course, more homestays are also part of that future. So through homestays, social reproduction, and the affective labors of making home, cooking, and caring for tourists, work that disproportionately falls on women, have become new sources of capital accumulation. The selling of experience, right, of these kind of reified, right, bucolic notions of what the hills can and should be in the context of climate crisis is not unique, however, to the hills. Homestays in Kalimpong are of a piece with other shifts in affective labor, or to affective labor in the context of twinned economic and environmental crisis. Homestays are not a new resource frontier then, they're just an intensified one. Homestay tourism, then, is not a redemptive alternative to resource extraction. Instead, it is one thread in the long, weedy trajectory of accumulation grounded in the ill effects of colonial development. Climate change and rapid agrarian transitions mean more work, specifically for those marginalized and most affected by the deleterious effects of environmental crises, particularly women. Right, and it's in images like people being with peacocks. Right, but then those peacocks then are kind of like super, like thinking to Kaji's paper, right, are on these YouTube videos, like come to Kalimpong to come see the landscape, and like there's like like in the background you can come see a peacock, and it's like you don't want to see any peacocks. Like peacocks are like, we don't want to see the peacocks. Like that's actually like this like real harbinger of change in a really bad way. Anyway, so scholars of infrastructure remind us that these mega projects, fragile by nature, collapse in many, often quite visible ways. Kalimpong and other government estates are kinds of colonial megaprojects. They take a lot of work to bring them into being, certainly, but also they take a lot of work to hold them together. That work takes place in agricultural fields, those that still exist, as well as in restaurant kitchens in New Delhi, and the Hebrew language training courses that are springing up in Siliguri, right, the border town between the hills and the plains, for would-be Nepali nurses immigrating to Israel to be nurses. It also takes place at home, in houses, in care for this growing influx of Indian tourists who want Nepalis or Lepchas to present them with an authentic experience of the hills, even though that authentic experience might be eating fish at 11 p.m. at night, which is a kind of antithetical to life in the hills. As global capital accumulation shifts from production to reproduction, with every tourist, with every landslide, with every farm family that can no longer make a living in agriculture, questions of the livability of the hills become more fraught for future generations. Thank you.